It was the kind of cold that gets inside your bones and makes a home there. The kind that turns breath into ghosts and makes every dollar in your pocket feel like a piece of ice you're afraid to melt. Margaret stood at the payphone outside the shuttered hardware store, her fingers numb around the last $47 she had in the world, listening to the line go dead for the third time that afternoon. The job was gone. The car was gone. The apartment would be gone by Friday. And somewhere in the hollow space between her ribs, hope was packing its bags too. She had walked 6 miles that morning from the motel where she'd been staying. If you could call it staying when you're paying by the hour, and the heater coughs out dust. The diner down the road had a sign saying they needed a waitress, but when she got there, the owner looked at her thrift store coat and the holes in her sneakers and told her they'd already hired someone. They hadn't. She could see it in his eyes. He just didn't want a woman who looked like defeat sitting in his booths. Margaret was 43 years old. She had buried her husband 3 years prior, watched the medical bills eat their savings like termites, and then watched the bank eat their house. She remembered the morning they took the keys, how the sheriff had stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, unable to meet her eyes. She remembered the boxes in the driveway, the neighbors watching from behind curtains, the way the world kept moving even as hers stopped. She remembered the hospital room where David had died, the beeping machines, the smell of antiseptic, the way he had squeezed her hand at the end and whispered that she was stronger than she knew. She had not believed him then. She had not believed anything except that the world was cruel and random and indifferent to the love between two people who had built a life together, only to see it dismantled by illness and interest rates. She had one daughter, Clara, who was living with an aunt 2 states away because Margaret couldn't feed her, let alone keep a roof over her head. The plan had been simple: get to the city, find work, send for Clara. But the city had chewed her up and spat her out, and now she was standing in a town she couldn't name holding $47 and wondering if the walk back to the motel was even worth the energy. That was when she saw the truck. It was an old Ford, the kind that had hauled 1,000 harvests and wore its rust like metals. It was tilted at a sad angle on the shoulder of the 2-lane highway, hazards blinking weakly against the gray afternoon. Steam hissed from under the hood like a kettle left too long on the stove. And leaning against the driver's side door was a man who looked like he had been beaten by the world and had gotten back up so many times that standing was now just habit. He was old, older than old. His face was a map of sun damage and worry lines, his hands swollen at the knuckles, his coat thin and patched at the elbows. He wasn't waving for help. He wasn't even looking at the passing cars. He was just staring at the engine, steam curling around his weathered face, with an expression that said he'd seen this before and knew exactly how much it was going to cost him. Margaret should have kept walking. Every instinct honed by 3 years of poverty told her to clutch that money, to look down, to keep moving. Compassion was a luxury of the secure. She knew that. She'd learned it the hard way, in the long lines and the colder nights, in the eyes of people who pretended not to see her. She had learned that survival meant narrowing your vision to your own feet, your own hunger, your own next breath. But something about the way he stood, the way his shoulders curved inward like a question mark, the way his hands hung at his sides, like tools that had finally found a job they couldn't fix, made her stop. She saw her husband in that posture. She saw herself. She saw what loneliness looked like when it wore a human face. "Need help?" she asked, and her voice sounded strange to her, cracked and unused. The old man turned. His eyes were the color of faded denim, and they took her in, not with pity, but with a kind of exhausted recognition, as if he saw in her the same broken thing he saw in himself. "Radiator hose blue," he said. His voice was gravel and honey. Need a new one. Auto parts store in town said they got one, but I gotta get there first, and I gotta get back, and my wallet's about as empty as a politician's promise. Margaret felt the money in her pocket. $47. Enough for 2 more nights at the motel, enough for a bus ticket closer to somewhere else, enough for a hot meal that wasn't from a vending machine. How much is the hose, she asked. $32, plus tax, plus I need coolant. Probably run me $45, $50. He laughed, but it was a dry, dead sound. Story of my life, always $50 short of keeping things running. The wind picked up. Margaret shivered. She thought of Clara, who was 12 years old and needed braces and loved strawberries and wanted to be a botanist when she grew up. She thought of the letter she'd gotten last week, Clara's small handwriting saying she missed her mom, saying the kids at school had new phones and new shoes, and she was trying not to want things because she knew they couldn't afford them. She thought of the drawing Clara had sent, a garden with sunflowers as tall as houses, a garden they would plant together when the world stopped being cruel. She thought of the $47, and then, with a movement that felt like it was happening to someone else, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled bills. She counted them in her frozen fingers. 2 20s, a 5, and 2 1s. $47, every cent she had. She held it out. The old man looked at the money. Then he looked at her. Then he looked at her shoes. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "you need this more than I do." "Probably," Margaret said. And she smiled. And it was the first time she'd smiled in months, and it hurt her face. "But you need it right now. And I've been needing things for 3 years. Another day won't kill me." He didn't take the money at first. He just stared at her like she was a miracle he couldn't quite believe. Then his eyes got wet, and he looked away quickly, blinking at the horizon. "I'm not a charity case," he said. "Rough." "Neither am I," Margaret replied. "But we're both stranded, aren't we?" He took the money then. His hand closed over hers, and his palm was calloused and warm, and it felt like holding a piece of firewood that had been burning all day. "My name's Elias Whitfield," he said. "I got a farm 2 counties over. Or I did. Bank's taking it next month if I can't get my greenhouse crop to market. These tomatoes. I've been growing this variety for 40 years. My grandfather brought the seeds from Italy in 1923. They're the only thing I got left that's worth anything. And if I don't get that hose fixed, I can't water them. And if I can't water them, they die. And if they die, I lose the land." Margaret nodded. She didn't know anything about greenhouses or heirloom tomatoes or Italian seeds from 1923, but she knew what it meant to have one thing left that you were clinging to with bloody fingernails. "Get your hose," she said. Elias looked at the money in his hand. Then he reached into the cab of his truck and pulled out a paper bag. It was greasy and folded and looked like it had once held lunch. "Wait here," he said. He walked across the street to the auto parts store. Margaret stood there, her pocket empty, her heart strangely light. She had just given away her last chance at a warm bed tonight, and yet she felt warmer than she had in years. 15 minutes later, Elias came back with a new hose and a jug of coolant. He worked quickly, his hands sure despite their age, and within half an hour the truck was running again. He slammed the hood and stood there looking at her. "I'm gonna pay you back," he said. "I don't know how, and I don't know when, but I'm gonna pay you back." "You don't owe me anything," Margaret said. "Everybody owes somebody something," Elias replied. "That's how the world works. That's how it keeps spinning." He held out the paper bag. "These are for you." Margaret took it. Inside were 6 small glass vials, each corked with a wad of wax. They were filled with seeds, tiny, dark, unremarkable things that looked like crumbs or grit. "My grandfather's tomatoes," Elias said. "There are 6 varieties here. They've been in my family for 100 years. I was gonna sell them at the market to save the farm, but I'm giving them to you because you didn't just give me money today. You gave me something I ain't had in a long time." "What's that?" Margaret asked. He looked at her with those faded denim eyes and he said, "You made me believe that good people still exist, and that's worth more than a farm." He got in his truck. He rolled down the window. "Plant them," he said, "not in the ground. They need warmth. They need protection. Build something around them, even if it's just plastic and sticks. They'll grow. They always grow if you give them a chance." And then he drove away, his exhaust coughing into the cold air, and Margaret stood on the side of the road with 6 vials of seeds and no money, and a heart that was breaking and mending at the same time. She didn't know it then, but she had just traded her last $47 for the future. The motel owner kicked her out the next morning. She had no money for the room, and he had no patience for stories about old men and seeds. She spent that night in the bus station, huddled on a plastic chair, the vials tucked inside her bra where they couldn't be stolen. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects, and the vending machine hummed its lonely song across the empty lobby. A security guard walked past every hour, eyeing her with suspicion, as if poverty were a crime she was committing in plain sight. She wrapped her arms around herself and tried to sleep, but the cold seeped up through the metal chair and into her spine, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw Clara's face, asking when Mommy was coming home. She spent the next night in a church basement that smelled of mildew and mercy. The cots were lined up in rows like a military barracks, and the other women who slept there spoke in whispers or didn't speak at all. Some cried in their sleep. Some snored like they were fighting for air. Margaret lay on her cot, the wooden box with the vials clutched to her chest, and listened to the sounds of broken dreams. A woman in the corner talked to herself, reciting a grocery list from some life that no longer existed. Another woman, younger than Margaret, rocked back and forth, her arms wrapped around a pillow she pretended was a child. In the morning, they served oatmeal that had been cooked too long, and Margaret ate it standing up, her eyes on the door, her mind already planning the day. She ate at soup kitchens where the volunteers looked through her, where the food was filling but never satisfying, where the tables were sticky with the residue of 1,000 meals eaten by 1,000 desperate people. She learned which churches served breakfast on which days, which gas stations had bathrooms they didn't lock, which dumpsters behind grocery stores yielded bread that was only a day past its sell-by date. She learned to sleep with one eye open, and she learned that dignity was something you carried inside, not something the world could give or take away. She walked miles every day, her feet blistering inside the sneakers with the holes, her legs aching from the miles she had already walked and the miles she still had to go. She developed a map in her head of the town's resources, the free clinic on Tuesdays, the library where she could sit in warmth for an hour, the park fountain where she could fill her bottle and wash her face. She learned to make herself small, to take up less space, to be invisible in a world that had no use for her. She learned that hunger was not just an empty stomach but a constant companion, a voice that whispered in your ear all day and all night, reminding you of everything you didn't have. But she did not sell the seeds. She found an abandoned lot on the edge of town, behind a factory that had closed down and left a wasteland of broken concrete and rusted chain link. There was a shed there, half collapsed, but the frame was solid, and there was sun, fierce, unrelenting sun that beat down on the cracked earth and made the weeds grow tall and angry. Margaret squatted in that shed. She cleaned it out, piece by piece, dragging out rotted wood and broken glass until her hands were raw and bleeding, her back screaming with every movement. She found old windows in the factory dumpster, dirty, cracked, but intact enough to let light through. She built a frame from 2x4s she salvaged from a construction site trash pile, pulling nails with a rock because she didn't have a hammer, splitting her fingertips until they were stained with rust and blood. She didn't know what she was doing. She'd never built anything in her life. But she remembered Elias's words. Even if it's just plastic and sticks, it took her 3 weeks to build a structure 12 feet by 8 feet. It leaned to the left like a drunk against a wall. It had gaps wide enough to let in the wind and the rain. When it rained, water came in through the seams and pooled on the dirt floor. And she had to bail it out with a discarded coffee can, her arms aching, her clothes soaked, her teeth chattering in the cold that followed every storm. But when the sun hit those old windows, the inside turned into a cathedral of light and warmth, a sacred space where the outside world ceased to exist, where the cold couldn't reach her, where hope could take root. She planted the seeds in cups she'd scavenged from the diner's trash. Yogurt containers. Soup cans with holes punched in the bottom using a nail she had found in the parking lot. She used dirt from the weedy lot, mixed with coffee grounds she collected from the gas station, with eggshells she saved from the shelter breakfast, with anything she could find that might feed a seed. She watered them with a discarded sports bottle she refilled at the park fountain, carrying it half a mile each way because she didn't have a faucet, her shoulders burning from the weight of the water, her throat parched because she always gave the plants the first drink. And she waited. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. The cups sat on the dirt floor of her crooked greenhouse, silent and dark, and Margaret woke every morning in the shed, cold and stiff, her breath frosting in the air, and checked the cups with a trembling heart. She talked to them. She told them about Clara, about the drawing of the garden, about the sunflowers as tall as houses. She told them about Elias, about the truck, about the $47. She told them about the husband she had lost, the house she had loved, the life she had planned. She begged them. She prayed over them. She sang to them, old songs her mother had sung, songs she hadn't thought of in decades, her voice cracked and off-key but full of a longing so deep it seemed to vibrate the air. On the 17th day, a green curl broke through the soil in the first cup. Margaret cried so hard she scared herself. She sat on the dirt floor of that crooked greenhouse, holding a yogurt cup with a sprout the size of a comma, a curl of green so small it was almost invisible, so fragile it seemed like a breath could destroy it. And she wept like she was being born, like she was coming up from deep water and tasting air for the first time. She wept for the husband she had buried, for the daughter she had sent away, for the house she had lost, for the dignity she had surrendered, for every morning she had woken up and not known how she would make it tonight. She wept because that tiny green curl was proof that life persists, that growth happens even in the worst conditions, that something beautiful could emerge from a yogurt cup in a broken shed on a dead-end lot. By summer, she had 6 tomato plants. They were gangly and strange, not like the thick hybrids she'd seen in grocery stores. These were delicate, with leaves that smelled like earth and honey when you touched them, with stems that were purple and fuzzy, and seemed to glow in the afternoon light. The fruit they bore was small, misshapen, streaked with colors that didn't look real, purple and gold and green stripes that ran like watercolor, like someone had painted them by hand. They were ugly and beautiful at the same time, like everything that survives hardship. She took 1 tomato to the diner. The owner, the same man who hadn't hired her, who had looked at her shoes and seen a problem, was out back smoking, leaning against the wall with the posture of a man who had given up on the day. She held out the tomato. He looked at it like it was a jewel, like it was something he had lost and never expected to see again. "What the hell is that?" he asked, and there was wonder in his voice. "It's an heirloom," Margaret said. "From Italy, 1923. My friend gave me the seeds. He said they've been in his family for 100 years. He bit into it without washing it, without slicing it, without salt. Juice ran down his chin, red and thick and fragrant. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were different. They were alive. They were hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food. "I'll buy 10, he said. "Every week, whatever you got. I'll pay cash. I'll pay up front. I'll put your name on the menu." I've been in this business 20 years, and I've never tasted anything like this. This tastes like summer. This tastes like something my grandmother used to grow in her backyard before she died. This tastes like a memory I didn't know I had. That first summer, she made $200 selling tomatoes to the diner and to neighbors who heard about the strange woman growing jewels in a broken shed, who came with curiosity and left with bags of fruit and tears in their eyes. She bought better plastic, thicker and clearer, from the hardware store seconds bin. She found more windows, dragged them from alleys and dumpsters, fitted them into her frame like puzzle pieces. She expanded the greenhouse to 20 feet, built a second table, found a discarded tarp that became a roof. She bought a used sleeping bag from the thrift store, so she didn't have to shiver through the nights, so she could sleep in the greenhouse and wake up with the plants. She wrote to Clara. She sent $50 and a photograph of the tomatoes, the 6 plants heavy with fruit, her greenhouse glowing in the background like a lantern in the dark. She told her daughter she was building something. She told her to be patient. She told her that spring was coming, that the world was turning, that soon they would be together again, and they would plant a garden so big the neighbors would talk about it for years. The second year, she had 40 plants. The third year, 100. She learned to save seeds, to cross-pollinate with a paintbrush, to prune for yield, to graft strong roots onto weak stems. She read every book about greenhouse agriculture she could find in the library trash piles and discarded boxes. Books with pages missing and covers torn off. Books that smelled like mold and knowledge. She made mistakes. She lost whole crops to mold that spread like a whisper, to pests that came in the night and devoured everything, to a frost that came too early and took everything she had nurtured for months, turning green to black in a single cruel night. But she always saved seeds from the survivors. She always started again. She always built back because she had learned that destruction was not the end, only the next beginning. The town started calling her the Tomato Lady. At first it was mocking, a name spoken with a smirk, a joke at the bar, a whisper in the grocery store. Children threw rocks at her plastic walls, laughing as they ran away. Adults whispered that she was crazy, that she lived in a shed, that she talked to plants, that she smelled like dirt and desperation. But then the food editor from the regional newspaper drove through on a slow news day, tasted a purple Cherokee, and he wrote a story about the woman who grew tomatoes that tasted like memories in a greenhouse built from garbage, about the widow who had nothing and built an empire of glass and hope. He called it The Miracle on Industrial Row. The story went viral in the way things did in 2008, spreading through emails and forums and early social media, shared by people who needed to believe that goodness was still possible. Suddenly, people were driving from 3 counties away to buy her tomatoes, waiting in lines that stretched down the block. A chef from the city offered her $500 for a month's supply, for exclusive rights, for anything she could grow. A seed company wanted to buy her varieties, to patent them, to mass-produce them and strip them of their history. She said no to the seed company. Those seeds weren't for sale. They were for growing. They were for remembering. They were for passing on. By year 5, Margaret had 3 greenhouses on that abandoned lot. She had a used RV to sleep in, with a heater that worked most of the time and a bed that didn't sag. She had hired 2 women from the shelter, women who knew what it meant to have nothing and need a chance, who understood that a job was not just money but dignity, not just work but belonging. She sent for Clara. Her daughter arrived on a bus in the spring, 16 years old and beautiful and fierce, carrying a backpack and a heart full of questions. When she saw the greenhouses, real structures now, with proper ventilation and irrigation, with rows of plants that stretched into the distance like a green ocean, with the smell of life so thick you could wear it, she stood at the entrance and cried the same way Margaret had cried over the first sprout. She cried for the years they had lost, for the letters that had been too short, for the phone calls that had been too rare, for the mother she had missed and feared for and loved from a distance. "You did this?" Clara asked, her voice full of awe and accusation, love and disbelief. "We did this," Margaret said, holding the 6 vials, now empty but kept in a wooden box on a shelf, a shrine to the moment everything changed. All of us, every seed, every prayer, every broke morning, every time I wanted to quit and didn't. You did this too, Clara. You were the reason I kept going. You were the sun I was growing toward." Clara started working beside her mother. She was smart, methodical, obsessed with the science of it, with pH levels and nutrient ratios and light spectra. She kept journals, thick notebooks filled with observations and sketches and data. She tracked yields. She built a website on a donated computer, learned to code from library books, created an online presence that drew customers from across the country. She started selling seeds online, heirloom varieties they'd developed themselves, bred from Elias's originals and adapted to the local soil, seeds with names that told stories. They called them the $47 tomatoes, and people bought them not just for the fruit but for the story, for the hope that came with them, for the reminder that even the smallest act of kindness could grow into something extraordinary. By year 10, Whitfield Gardens covered 2 acres. There were 12 greenhouses, each one bigger and better than the last, each one a testament to what persistence could build. They employed 15 people, all from shelters or recovery programs or simply down on their luck, people who had been told they were worthless and were given a chance to prove otherwise. Margaret's rule was simple. If you needed a job, you got one. If you needed to learn, she taught you. If you needed to talk to the plants, no one laughed. If you needed to cry in the greenhouse, the plants would keep your secret. The community that had mocked her now protected her like a treasure. When a storm tore through and ripped the plastic off 3 greenhouses, 20 neighbors showed up with tools and tarps before dawn, working through the rain to save the crop, because they knew that Whitfield Gardens was not just a farm, it was a symbol of what their town could be. When the county tried to zone her out of existence, calling her operation an eyesore, an illegal use, a nuisance, the diner owner and the chef and 300 customers signed a petition that made the commissioners back down, that made them realize you cannot zone out hope. Margaret was 53 years old. She had lines around her eyes from the sun, and her hands were permanently stained with chlorophyll, and she had not been cold or hungry or hopeless in a very long time. She had a home. She had her daughter. She had a legacy that was growing every day, reaching into the soil and the sky, changing lives one seed at a time. But she never stopped wondering about Elias. She had tried to find him. She'd written to every Whitfield in the state, letters that came back unopened or forwarded to dead ends. She'd checked property records at the county courthouse, poring over dusty files until her eyes burned. She'd driven to the county he'd mentioned, looking for a farm with a greenhouse, asking at diners and gas stations and feed stores, describing an old man with faded denim eyes and hands that knew soil. But the bank had taken it, just like he'd feared. The land had been sold to a developer who had built a strip mall where tomatoes once grew. There was no trace of Elias Whitfield. He had vanished into the machinery of progress, into the grinding gears of a system that took farms and turned them into parking lots. She kept the wooden box with the empty vials on her desk, in the office of a business that now grossed $1 million a year. She told the story to every reporter, every customer, every new employee who sat across from her, wide-eyed and wondering. I gave him my last $47. He gave me the future. She said it so often it became a prayer, a mantra, a mission statement. Year 12 brought a letter. It was addressed simply to the Tomato Lady, Whitfield Gardens, with no street address, just the town name. The postman knew where to bring it. Everyone knew where to bring things for the Tomato Lady. The handwriting was shaky. The letters formed with a pen that had skipped and scratched, with ink that had faded in places, as if written by a hand that no longer obeyed its owner. Dear Margaret, I hope these words find you. I've been looking for you for 11 years. I asked at every diner, every gas station, every church basement between here and the coast. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry I'm writing instead of coming. The farm is gone, has been for years. The bank took it 6 months after you saved me, 6 months after I got that crop to market and paid down the debt just enough to delay the inevitable. I've been living with my sister in a nursing home, and I don't get out much anymore. My legs don't work like they used to. My eyes are going. But I read about you in a magazine someone left in the common room. I saw your picture. I saw the greenhouses. I saw my grandfather's tomatoes. You kept them alive. You kept me alive. I didn't know it then, but when you gave me that money, you didn't just save my crop. You saved my faith that the world was worth staying in. And that belief kept me breathing through the worst years of my life. I lost the land, but I didn't lose everything. Because I knew you were out there, growing something. I knew that somewhere in a greenhouse built from hope, my grandfather's seeds were still living. And as long as they lived, I lived too. I don't have much. I'm 87 now. My hands don't work like they used to. I can't hold a pen without shaking. But I have one more thing to give you. In the box with this letter, there are seeds. Not tomatoes this time. Peppers. My grandmother's. From the same village in Italy. She used to dry them in the sun and grind them into powder that could make a grown man weep. They need warmth. They need protection. Build something around them. Love them the way you loved me. I am so proud of you. I am so proud of us. Margaret read the letter 12 times. She sat at her desk in the office of a business that now grossed $1 million a year, and she shook with sobs that started in her toes and worked their way up, wave after wave of grief and gratitude and love. Clara found her there, still crying, holding the letter in a small wooden box, her face wet and shining. They planted Elias's peppers that spring. They built a new greenhouse just for them, the 13th, and they called it the 47 House. The peppers grew into bushes heavy with fruit, long, twisted, fire-red peppers that tasted like sunlight and history, like the old country and the new, like sacrifice and reward. They dried them and ground them and sold the powder in small jars, and people drove from states away to buy it, to taste the legacy of a woman and an old man who had met on the side of a road. Elias died 6 months after sending the letter. Margaret didn't find out until a year later, when his sister wrote to tell her. He had kept a photograph of Margaret's first greenhouse, cut from a newspaper, yellowed and creased, taped to the wall beside his bed. He had told everyone in the nursing home the story. Every nurse, every visitor, every resident who would listen. He had died with a smile on his face. His sister said, as if he had seen something beautiful waiting for him. By year 15, Whitfield Gardens had 50 greenhouses. They had a research program, a partnership with the university, students who came to study their methods. They had a scholarship fund for kids who wanted to study agriculture but couldn't afford college, funded by a percentage of every sale, named after Elias. They had a waiting list for their community-supported agriculture boxes that stretched 2 years, a list of families who wanted to eat food that had been grown with love and memory. They had bred and preserved over 200 varieties of heirloom vegetables, many of them on the verge of extinction before Margaret and Clara brought them back from the edge, saved them like Elias had been saved. Clara went to college on a full scholarship. She studied botany, just like she'd always wanted, just like the drawing had promised. She came back every summer to work the greenhouses, and when she graduated, she came back for good. She was the science, Margaret was the soul. Together they were unstoppable, a mother and daughter who had been separated by poverty and reunited by tomatoes, who had built a life from seeds and sacrifice. The town that had once been a rusted factory wasteland was now known as the greenhouse capital of the region. Other farmers had come, drawn by the soil and the sun and the story, drawn by the proof that this land could support life if you treated it with respect. Restaurants opened, farm-to-table places that celebrated the local harvest, a seed bank, a repository of genetic diversity, a vault against the future, an agricultural school where young people learned to grow food instead of consuming it. What had been a dead zone was now alive, breathing, growing, a testament to what one person's courage could catalyze. And it had started with $47. It had started with a woman who had nothing and gave it anyway. It had started with an old man who had lost everything but still had seeds to share. Year 18. Margaret was 61. Her hair was silver, and she wore it long, tied back with a piece of twine, the same way she had since the early days. She still worked in the greenhouses every day, still checked the seedlings every morning, still talked to them like they were old friends who had seen her through the darkest nights. She had a house now, a real house with a porch and a kitchen and a bathtub deep enough to sink into, a luxury she still couldn't quite believe. But she often slept in the RV, parked between the greenhouses, because she liked to wake up surrounded by growing things, because the sound of plants breathing was the lullaby that had sung her to sleep for 18 years. It was spring, the planting season. The air smelled of wet earth and possibility, of beginnings and renewals, of all the miracles that were still waiting to happen. Margaret walked the paths between the greenhouses, her boots crunching on the gravel, her hands trailing along the frames she had built, the frames her daughter had improved, the frames that held worlds inside them. She stopped at each one, looking through the glass at the rows of green life inside, at the leaves that caught the light and turned it into sugar and hope. There were tomatoes, of course, dozens of varieties, from the original Italians to new ones they'd bred themselves, with names like Margaret's Hope and Elias's Promise and Clara's Dream. There were peppers and eggplants and cucumbers and melons and flowers and herbs. There were experiments, failures, triumphs. There was life, stacked upon life, stretching to the horizon. A green city built by 2 women and a memory, 300 greenhouses. She stood at the highest point on the property, a small hill they'd built as an overlook, and she looked out at what had been born from 6 vials of seeds and an act of desperation from $47 and a leap of faith. 300 structures of glass and steel and wood and plastic, each one glowing in the morning sun like a lantern, like a church, like a promise kept, each one filled with plants that had been saved, nurtured, loved into existence, each one representing a person who had been given a chance, a job, a home, a purpose, a reason to wake up in the morning, each one a chapter in a story that was still being written. Behind her, she heard footsteps, Clara, now 30 years old, brilliant and fierce, carrying a tablet and a cup of coffee, her eyes bright with news. "Mom," Clara said, "you're going to want to see this. What is it?" Clara handed her the tablet. On the screen was a news article from a national paper, a story that had traveled across the country, that had been shared by millions. The headline read, "The $47 Miracle: How One Act of Kindness Built an Agricultural Empire and Saved a Town." But that wasn't what made Margaret's breath catch. Below the headline was a photograph. A photograph of her, taken 18 years ago, standing outside that first crooked greenhouse, the one that leaned and leaked and glowed. She was thin and worn and her clothes were rags, but she was smiling. She was holding a tomato in one hand and a yogurt cup in the other, and she looked like a woman who had just discovered that the world was bigger than her pain. And beside the photograph was a picture of Elias, younger than she remembered, standing in front of a greenhouse of his own, his hand on a tomato vine, his faded denim eyes looking straight at the camera with a pride that bordered on defiance, with a love that had outlasted his farm. The article told the whole story. A journalist had spent 2 years tracking down the details, interviewing people, finding records, piecing together the fragments of a life that had seemed lost. It told how a broke widow had given away her last money to a stranger on the worst day of her life. It told how that stranger had given her seeds that had been in his family for a century, seeds that carried 100 years of love and survival. It told how those seeds had grown into 300 greenhouses, 200 jobs, a scholarship fund, a seed bank, a transformed community, a changed world. It told how Elias Whitfield had died believing in goodness, and how Margaret had spent 18 years proving he was right to believe. Margaret handed the tablet back. She looked out at the greenhouses. The sun was higher now, and the glass was catching the light, turning each structure into a prism, a cathedral, a promise kept. The light refracted through the glass and scattered across the fields in rainbows, and for a moment the whole world seemed to be made of color and hope. "I wish he could see this," she whispered. "He does," Clara said, stepping beside her, taking her hand. "Every day, in every tomato, in every seed we save, in every person we hire who was just like you, broke and scared and desperate for someone to believe in them. He sees it, Mom. He always saw it. That's why he gave you the seeds." Margaret nodded. She reached into her pocket. She didn't know why. It was habit, maybe, or instinct, or the ghost of a woman who had once been so afraid that she had learned to prepare for the worst. Her fingers closed around a folded bill. She pulled it out. It was a 50, crumpled and soft from being carried too long, from being washed and dried and carried again. A bill that had traveled with her for 18 years, through every pocket of every coat she owned. She looked at it, and she laughed. The laugh was soft and surprised, and full of a joy that had taken 18 years to build. "What?" Clara asked. "I just realized," Margaret said. "I've been carrying this around for 18 years. Ever since I had money again. Ever since the first sale, the first profit, the first moment when I wasn't drowning. I've been keeping a $50 bill in my pocket, just in case." "In case what?" "In case someone needs it more than I do. In case I meet another Elias. In case the world sends me someone who's stranded, who's broken, who needs to know that good people still exist. I've been waiting for that moment. I've been ready for it. Every day for 18 years. She looked at her daughter, at the greenhouses, at the life she had built from nothing, from seeds and sweat and the kindness of strangers. She thought about the cold day, the broken truck, the steam, the old man with the map of pain on his face. She thought about the $47. She thought about how sometimes the smallest things, a handful of seeds, a moment of compassion, a belief that refuses to die, can grow into something that changes the world. something that outlasts the person who planted it. She tucked the 50 back into her pocket. She would give it away tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that, to someone stranded, to someone hopeless, to someone who needed to be reminded that good people still exist, and that the world keeps spinning because we owe each other something, because we are bound together by threads of kindness that stretch across years and miles and durations. Margaret walked down the hill, into the greenhouses, into the warmth, into the green. The tomatoes were heavy on the vines, bending the stems with their weight. The peppers were beginning to flower, small white stars that would become fire. The seeds were waiting in their packets, ready for the soil, ready for the chance, ready for the hands that would plant them and love them and watch them grow. And somewhere in the space between a broken truck and a 300 greenhouse miracle, the story continued, not because of magic, not because of luck, but because one woman, on the worst day of her life, had looked at a stranger and seen herself, because she had recognized his pain as her own, because she had understood that we are all just walking each other home, and she had given him everything she had. The greenhouses bloomed,